At Construction Advisor, our focus is on improving the wellbeing of everyone who works in construction. And when we start to analyse the mental health statistics of this industry particularly, it's quite serious. 1 in 4 Australians in any 1 year can suffer a mental health episode. And in the 21st century, there is still a degree of stigma about being able to talk about it. So when we come across people who are prepared to talk about it, who can share their personal story and particularly the positive results that have come from it, we think it's important to bring that message to you. Today we have the pleasure of being able to interview Ross Jones, who happens to be one of the senior people at Jacobs, who has a very interesting wellbeing story to tell us. So Ross, welcome.
Thank you. I'm an environmental scientist by trade and have been working in the engineering and environmental consulting area for about 20 years. Prior to that, I worked for the New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority in their environmental area, doing route selections and environmental impact statements for major roadworks. My current role in Jacobs is the Vice President and Executive Director of Strategic Growth for the Asia-Pac and Middle East region.
We'll come to today a little bit later, but before we get to that stage, what would be great is for you to share with us, I guess, the reason for why we're having this discussion today.
So about 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago now, I was in the middle management of the predecessor of Jacobs, which was Sinclair Knight Mertz, and was in a role that had its own levels of pressure. And in all of those aspects, I was very much a perfectionist. And when you're a perfectionist to the extreme, it certainly puts a very big burden on your mental health. So certainly my experience was that I couldn't see any positives. I didn't know why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And everyone I talked to just pretty much said, you know, get over it, get happy, you've got a great life, so suck it up. So it all came to a crescendo one morning when I was meeting up with some mates before work, and I wanted to sit down with them and talk over what was going on in my head, and for whatever reason I just turned into a blubbering mess. When I got to work, it was like the hard disk in my brain just stopped and I couldn't even type in my password. And thankfully I'd been doing some work on helping with the not-for-profit set of counselling centres, and I thought I've just got to get to the cottage counselling centres. So I drove there and was fortunate to be put straight in with a great counsellor, Nikki, and she was able to go through some questions with me and establish that I was suffering what was called a major depressive event. In colloquial language, it's a nervous breakdown, and she was able to get me to a GP and who was able to prescribe me with some medication. So
when all this happened, how would you describe the reaction of your wife and family? What was going on with them when this was occurring?
Well, thankfully, Nikki, the counsellor, called my wife, and she came down to the counselling centre, and she was a bit upset, a bit confused, in a bit of a mess, trying to be the person keeping it all together, and was thankfully the one who was listening to Nikki with what was going to happen over the next couple of weeks, certainly as things became more acute.
So, and when you said your wife came down and she was obviously upset, did she indicate afterwards that she had any idea that this could have been a possibility?
She knew something was up, and I'd been talking to her about something being up, but we both didn't suspect depression. We both thought that I was an extrovert, and extroverts didn't get depressed, but they actually do. After about 2 weeks, I was able to get back to work, and then it was probably about 12 months of counselling and on medication before I felt like I was operating at 100%. And
were you surprised at how long that took?
Yeah, I was. And it was interesting, a friend of mine asked me after about 12 months, did I ever think about depression? And I said I gave him an answer that I still give today, which is every day I think about it. It's a major event a major issue or event that people go through in their lives, and your life is sort of defined by before and after that event.
Given that this experience has had such a significant impact on your life, Ross, what kinds of lessons do you feel you've learnt so that both for yourself and for others they may be able to vicariously learn from your experience? For example, do you find that you're checking yourself more regularly?
Well, I do a check-in every day, if you like, on where my head's at. And I also look for physical signs, so I know that when I did go through that depressive event, I had certain physical signs, whether it be ears burning or tingling in fingers, that gave me a signal that I wasn't quite right. I also found it important to engage in regular physical activity. It's a great serotonin booster, so that's been great and good for fitness as well. And also to have some interests outside of work where you're actually serving other people. So getting the focus off yourself or off myself has been a really useful thing as well.
I think in our earlier conversation you mentioned how supportive the organisation was. What difference did that make, that when you were actually ready to come back to work, that you felt you were in an environment that would be sympathetic to the situation and assist you in the process of healing?
Fortunately, I had a boss who was just magnificent at the time. I rang him up and told him what had happened, and he was very supportive, called up on me while I was away almost daily, and then in the period coming back to work, had a sort of back to work plan that was manageable and that took into account where I was at.
So almost like in the same way that with a physical injury we have a return to work plan, you had a similar one for a mental health injury.
Very much, very much.
Would you have any suggestions for other employers within construction in terms of what they might be able to do to either preempt problems occurring in the first place or how to deal with them if they do somehow arise?
Jacobs has been on a bit of a journey for the past 10 years or so, coincidentally, and we started off very much looking at raising awareness about mental illness, and we started that off because we spent a lot of money on protecting our workers' physical safety, but we found that the incident that was taking people the longest to get back to work was stress-related mental illness. A key turning point was when we stopped thinking about, is it our fault that people are suffering from depression, and we just realised that whether it's the work environment or whether it's issues outside of work, they're still our people, and if they were suffering from a physical illness, we would help them. And that was a big change, and so we became much more proactive then, and really looked at ways to help our staff, acknowledging that they were going to suffer from a mental illness at some stage. The stats are that Australian adults, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 are going to suffer a mental illness at some stage in their life, so why would we be any different as an organisation?
If you were able to speak to the industry at large, based on both your personal experience and what you've seen work at Jacobs, are there any suggestions you could make for what the rest of the industry might be able to do in this arena?
Yeah, look, I think the first step is to acknowledge that it is going to happen to your workforce, whether it be depression or anxiety or whatever mental illness, it will happen. And to get over the issue of whose fault it is. Once you get past that, you start thinking about how can we care for our people as opposed to protecting the organisation.
Or how much is this going to cost us if we start to move into areas that are normally outside our domain?
Yeah. If you think you're suffering from any of the symptoms that I've talked about, get help. Speak to a professional, speak to your EAP group, contact your GP. Don't leave it untreated. it's something that can be treated. You can live a very productive life. You can even progress in organisations, which I've been fortunate enough to do.
To what extent do you feel that, in your experience at Jacobs, that you understand that, and that you have any suggestions about how we might be able to help them deal with some of those sorts of things?
Jacobs are working on a number of design and construct projects with the Tier 1 contractors. So we know the pressures that they're under, and that in turn we're under from them. I think certainly we're discussing with some of the Tier 1 contractors and clients about using something like the mental health check-in to provide an opportunity for workers to be able to see where they're at from a mental health perspective, and then proactively be able to try and do something about it as well. One of the things we tried to do that was only a small thing to try and create an environment where people felt that they were safe to put their hand up and ask for help was in our inductions for new staff. We make a point of talking about our organisational attitude to mental illness, and that it certainly won't be a career killer. If people need some help, we'll be there for them.
That's wonderful, and it's really heartening, because, as we said before, that's what our focus is to help people in the industry do what they have to do more effectively, more enjoyably. And if organisations can walk the talk and genuinely support the people business that they're in, everyone will benefit. Thank you for your time, Ross. It's such a great story, because look at how well it's ended. So if we can help anyone else out there to, I guess, listen to the message and act on it, that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, very nice to have you.